Hello, FYIC. This video is all about the basics of data visuals. It is aimed at folks in Business 102, as we're talking about Business 102 assignments, and it's something that can be used by everyone in the FYIC. My name is Dr. Julia Alexander. Let's get started. So in this video, you are going to learn what a data visual is and what's important to know about them, what the different parts of a data visual are, and the difference between figures and tables. I know that's a little tricky. What you need to consider when using a data visual to support your point in a report or something like that. How you create one, and how you prepare another source's data visual for use in your own work. And how do you integrate and cite data visuals in business documents and in slide decks. This is kind of a lengthy video. Grab a snack, perhaps a pie or a donut or even a waffle, and we will charge on ahead. So let's talk about the word a data visual. It's composed of data and visual. Data are verifiable facts and statistics that are collected together for reference or analysis. Now, data can be statistics, survey results, quotes, interviews, etc. They're basically sources that you use in your research. Sources are pieces of data. And the visual part is short for visual rhetoric. And you know a little bit about rhetoric already, but when we take it to another level, the visual level, it becomes about images and other visual elements that convey points or make arguments or convey messages. So data plus visual rhetoric makes a data visual. And now you know what things are. So it's a part of rhetoric, a data visual is. So that means there's some important things to consider. Data does make different arguments depending on how it's interpreted by a writer and their audience. How data is designed visually affects how it's interpreted. So how you actually put a chart or a graph or a table together makes a difference in how an audience will understand that data. If you design it a certain way, it might make a different argument than maybe what was just in the data alone. And as responsible rhetoricians and as ethical business people, it's important not to mislead the audience by creating data visuals that make inaccurate or untrue arguments about your data. So this is one of the major dangers in making data visuals. You got to make sure that you're being accurate whenever you make them, just like making any kind of argument. Let's talk a little bit about the parts. So there's two kinds of data visuals, tables and figures. More on that in a second. Let's look at tables first. So we got a table here. Let's look at the different parts. Here's the first part. That is the table itself, the whole thing. This particular table was created by a writer using an outside data set. So they used some data. The top row and the left column are the key to understanding the data in the cell. So on the left column, you see dates, and on the top row, you see the names of turtles. And this right here, which is the title of the table, the label in the title of the table, gives it some context. Now, tables are always labeled and have their title at the top. And it has to give enough information so that the data visual can stand alone if necessary. So it has to give enough context. Total pizza slices eaten per turtle per month. Okay, I understand that. Right here is the word table and then the number of the table as it would appear if it were in a report or a slide deck. This is one thing that we always do with data visuals. We give them numbers, and tables are numbered separately from figures. And right down here is the word source and then the source of the data. This goes underneath the table and it's not in parentheses. And as you're looking, if you're using APA style, the source info should look like an in-text citation. So as you can see, the title's at the top, the source information's at the bottom on this particular type of data visual. That's a table. All right, let's look at a figure. So right here, again, the entire figure itself. This is a pie chart, obviously, but there's lots and lots of different kinds of figures that are out there. Bar graphs, scatter plots, maps, waffles, donuts. There are all kinds of different figures. Right here is the key. The key helps the reader interpret this figure. The important thing about this is that it absolutely has to be readable. Your audience has to be able to see it or they're not going to make sense of the data at all. This right here in the braces is the label and the title. Now, figures are always labeled and have their title at the bottom, as opposed to tables which have their title at the top. The title must give enough information so that the data visual could stand alone if necessary. And if you look at the title here, composition of medium pizza ordered by Raphael Entero. Sorry, I'm yawning. March 18th, 1989. So this tells me everything I need to know to understand kind of the context there. Right here, right after that, is the word source and the source of the data. So for figures, you want to put the source information in parentheses. If you're using APA, again, the source info should look like an in-text citation. One more thing. The word figure and the number of the figure go right in front of the title. Figures are numbered separately from tables. So if you have 2 tables in a document and 1 figure, you'd have table 1 and table 2 and figure 1. If you had 5 figures in a document and 2 tables, you'd have figures 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and tables 1 and 2. Now, this is something that is always challenging, is trying to figure out like when is it a figure and when is it a table. So the only time a data visual is called a table is when you make the table yourself using some kind of data set. Any other data visual other than a table you made yourself is called a figure. Sorry, I'm yawning. It's late at night. Even if it's a table created by someone else, like if it's a table you found in a library source, for instance, it's still called a figure. I know, Joey. I'm confused too. So I was thinking about it. What's the best way to clarify this? Another figure. I made a little flowchart for you. At the very top, is your data visual a table or a figure? The first question you ask yourself is, did you make it yourself? If the answer is no, it's a figure. Now, if the answer is yes, then you have to ask yourself, does the data visual have columns, rows, and cells? If yes, then it's a table. If no, then it's a figure. That's a little bit simpler. All right, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about how we're using data visuals to support points in business documents. You first want to think about your rhetorical situation, always. Whenever you are using these things, just like any other source, you've got to think about your purpose, your audience, and your context. Let's talk about purpose first. Why? What are you doing this for? What is the purpose of this thing you're making? Are you trying to convey information? Are you trying to pitch a product? What exactly are you doing with your report or with your slide deck? You always have to ask yourself why, so that you know if the data visual is going to advance your purpose or not. Then you got to ask yourself, who's your audience? Your audience wants what they want. You have to give them what they want, or your communication is not going to be successful. Whenever you're using a data visual, you have to ask yourself, is this going to give the audience what they want? Just like any other source. And then finally, you got to ask yourself, what's the context? In what situation is this being presented? Is it on a big old board here with lots and lots of things? Is it being presented in a paper? Is it being presented in a big old pitch deck? Is the audience excited about it? Are they not excited about it? Those can all contribute to how you are going to be using a data visual. So, rhetorical situation, purpose, audience, and context is the first thing you always want to consider. A couple other things to remember. You don't want to use data visuals just because. Don't just put them in there because, hey, if I put a graph in there, it'll look cool. Or it'll make me look smart. Instead, you got to look for places where data visuals can make your points clearer or more convincing. Here's an example. So say we had some information about languages spoken in the United States, and we were trying to point out some of the different languages that were spoken in different states. Oh, excuse me, I'm yawning again. That's terrible. The most commonly spoken language besides English and Spanish varies by state. In Idaho, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, Wisconsin, Missouri, Arkansas, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama, it's German. In Washington, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas, it's Vietnamese. We could go on and list all of these states and tell you which is the most commonly spoken language besides English and Spanish. We could just list it in text. It would be perfectly accurate, but boy, it would be hard to remember all of those things. Or we could use a data visual, like so. Most commonly spoken language other than English or Spanish, we've got a map of the United States. We're looking at states, and we've identified the particular states. And it's a lot easier to interpret this than it is to read a whole bunch of text. So again, don't use data visual just because. Look for places where data visuals can make your points clearer or more convincing. And another important thing with this, direct your audience's attention to the points you want to make and clear away the clutter. You want to create the most simple and clear data visuals you can, and you can modify existing data visuals to highlight clear points, to highlight key points, as long as you don't distort the data. Let me show you an example. Right here, I have a chart about the retirement age for men. It lists a whole bunch of countries. And we have this, it came from some other source, but say we wanted to use it, but really we only care about the retirement ages in Europe, these countries here. We've got a couple of other countries, Japan, New Zealand, United States, Australia, and we don't really care about those. We're just looking at Europe. We can change up this data visual to make it easier and clear away some of the clutter. So in this one, we have taken away the nations that we're not worried about. We've just isolated the European nations, but we can make it even simpler than that. We can simplify the colors because all of those colors, they don't really mean anything. They're just there for decoration, and that's not something we want. We want colors to mean something when they're in a data visual. If they don't have any meaning, they can be distracting to an audience. If we make all of these the same color, you can see that this chart is, or this particular bar graph is getting progressively easier to understand. Make sense? Of course it does. And I wouldn't expect you to answer me anyway because, you know, I'm talking into a microphone in the middle of the night. Moving on. So, another important thing. Be critical and ethical in your use of data visuals, like I mentioned before. Make sure you present your data accurately. Don't distort it either intentionally or unintentionally. Here's an example of this. Right here we've got two data visuals. They both actually depict the same data, but they tell very different stories. So let's take a look at them a little bit more closely. Here's this one that says that abortions are up and life-saving procedures down. And as you can see, the arrows here, it looks like abortions are way, way up, and that cancer screenings and prevention services are way, way, way down. It looks like abortions are actually up as much as cancer screenings are down. That's how it looks on this particular data visual as it's created now. But if you look a little more closely, you'll see it's not accurate. Look right here at the numerical data. Right here in the cancer screenings and prevention services, we have at the beginning here in 2006, 2 million and some, and then at the end of 2013, 935,000 and some. So that's a big decrease, a decrease of over 1 million since 2006. And if we look at abortions, if we look at the trajectory of this arrow, we'd expect a similar increase, but that's actually not the case. If we look at the numerical data, it's only an increase of about 37,000 since 2006. Now, 37,000 and 1,071,000 are two hugely different numbers. One's quite a bit smaller than the other. But on this particular data visual, it makes it look like those increases and decreases are the same in terms of amounts. And the problem is there's no y-axis. Over there on the left-hand side is where you'd see a y-axis. And for it to be accurate, for the data to be accurate, you'd have to have a y-axis that was consistent. There's not a consistent scale here either, so this is really misleading. This is a more accurate depiction of the data. As you can see, there's a slight increase in abortions, but it's not as big as the decrease in cancer screening and preventative services. And that's because we have a defined y-axis and a consistent scale here. Again, both of these things depict the same data, but one, with its visual design, is pretty misleading and one is more accurate. Okay. Now, we need to talk a little bit about preparing other sources' data visuals for use in your own work, because you're allowed to do that. And these are some of the key things you got to remember. When you get a visual from another source, you got to remember that it was made for the context of the source you got it from, not from your own document. That's really key to remember. I don't think everyone always remembers that when they're starting out. So you always have to modify a source that you pull from someone else's particular document somehow. Maybe you retitle it, maybe you clarify parts of it, maybe you provide more information about it, etc., etc. And you do that so that the audience for your own report or slideshow can understand. And before you even begin preparing that, though, you got to do a couple of things. You got to make sure that the data visual that you're thinking about using is readable. It shouldn't be pixelated, blurry, incomplete, or in a language your readers can't understand. Don't give me something like this. I can't read that at all. The text on there is terribly unclear, and honestly, this is one of the scariest data visuals I've ever seen. But it goes to show that if you can't quite understand it, your reader won't be able to. And that goes to my next point. Make sure you can explain the data visual as it is. Can you explain it as it appears in someone else's document? If you had to, could you explain all the parts of it to someone who hadn't seen it before? Anything you put into your own report or slideshow is fair game for the audience to question, so don't get caught off guard. And make sure you can explain why the data visual is important to your own point. If you can't, there's no reason to use it. So, when you are preparing to put a data visual from someone else's source into your own work, here are the steps to take. First, you want to identify the key argument in the data visual that you want to use. So ask yourself, what's the key point that this data visual is making? And make sure it's supportive of your own argument. Then, you want to gather all the citation information from the source. So you got to have the name of the author, where the data visual appeared, the date it was published, etc., etc. Don't lose this information. Save it, write it down somewhere, because you're going to need it. Then, you want to make the data visual more accessible, if necessary. Don't assume your audience will immediately understand what point the data visual is making. That's your job. You got to highlight the features of the data visual that make the key argument and clear away clutter, unnecessary info, stuff like that. Also, don't assume that you can't improve the data visual to make it easier to read and understand. People make data visuals all the time that are not so great, and some that could be great if they were a little clearer. So rewrite labels if necessary, change colors for better contrast, make the text more readable, make sure the scale is consistent, etc., etc. But we're not done. If it's appearing in someone else's source, it probably has a number that works for their particular document, but not for yours. So you need to take out the original number and then give the data visual a new number that fits into your document. So if it was originally called like table 3-4 in a source, but it's the first table in your document, you got to take that off and give it a different number, like table 1. That's so it makes sense in your document. Then you want to take out the original title and give the data visual a new title that makes sense for your document. So it might have originally been called Cases 2017 to 2019, as it appeared in the original source. But when you put it in your document, that might not mean very much. You might have to give it another name. So if you retitled this like Reported Malaria Cases in Nigeria 2017 to 2019, that provides the missing context for your reader. And then, of course, you need to add any additional information. For instance, in the above example, will the reader know that this came from the World Health Organization, or do you need to add that to the label when you put it in your own document? And then, of course, no matter what, whenever you put a data visual into your own documents, you got to integrate it, cite it, and explain why it supports your point. So that's what you do to prepare a data visual from another source to use in your own work. But let's talk about making them ourselves. This is always fun. Making things is great, but you got to consider a couple of things. First of all, if I'm going to make a data visual, I need some data. What is the data I'm using? And what does that data actually say? So you need to get data from somewhere, a list of dates, a list of figures, a list of information about the changes in financial solvency of something. Where are you getting that? And does that data actually support a point that you can use? Can you draw an accurate conclusion from it? If you can't, then don't use it. Don't start putting it into a data visual. You got to make sure that that data is saying something that you need to support your points. Then you got to ask yourself, what does the type of visual I'm using say? And does that match up with the data? So, like, there are lots of kinds of data visuals out there, as I mentioned, and they're not always the best choices for the kinds of data that you have. For example, if your data shows like a change in prices over time, a pie chart would not be a good choice to make your data visual, because pie charts generally only show amounts as part of a whole. We're talking about a change in price. That would not be a good pie chart data visual. It has to be something else, like maybe a bar graph or something like that. And then you got to ask yourself again, can I make the point I want to make with this data visual? No matter what, you're still responsible for explaining how your data visual makes your point. You have to make your point in addition to having that data visual there. You can't just drop it into your report or slideshow and expect magic. Because you'll look as foolish as this guy. Anyway. All right. Here are some steps to go through when creating your own data visual. First, you got to get some data. You can turn all kinds of data into data visuals, but you do need that data. Then you got to choose a format. Ask yourself, again, what is this data showing me? And make sure you pick the right kind of data visual to clearly show this to your reader. Look to your resources to help you choose the proper chart, graph, table, map, etc. What exactly are you showing? Let's find the right kind of data visual to show that. Then you make it. There are many ways to make this. Microsoft Office is probably the first place a lot of students would turn. There are a lot of applications that can do this. I believe you can make them in Excel, you can make them in PowerPoint, Word, stuff like that. But those aren't the only places. Google Drive has stuff too, but there are lots of other applications and things out there. There are lots of options. You need to actually dig into the internet a little bit and start Googling around and see what kinds of generators are there and what they can produce. It takes time. You got to find out the best way. You also need to make sure that you make your data visual accessible. Don't assume that like a basic chart generator will make a clear chart. That's a rookie mistake. Look at everything. Is all the text clear and readable? What about the labels? Do they make sense? Do you need more labels? Do you need fewer labels? Do any colors contrast clearly? Is the scale accurate and consistent? Stuff like that. When you actually create a pie chart, for instance, from Excel, it'll make you a nice looking pie, but the key that it makes for you is almost unreadable. The colors in the key are so tiny that they're hard to read. The text is so tiny it's hard to read. It's technically correct, but it's inaccessible, and it will be very hard for your reader to understand. So you have to, even when you use a generator, double check it. And then, as before, integrate that data visual into your own writing, cite it correctly, and explain why it supports your point. Are you noticing a pattern here? Perhaps. Let's talk about that. Now, if you use a data visual of any kind, even if you make it yourself, you can't just drop it into your paper and call it a day, because your instructor will look at you like this. Expand on that. Expand on that. Tell me why. So, when you use a data visual correctly, you have to always do this. Integrate it into your own writing. Cite it correctly and in a way that works for your audience. And explain why that data visual supports your point. Integrate, cite, explain. Integrate, cite, explain. ICE. ICE. Oh, ice. Yes. ICE. Let's break it down. I is for integrate. And this is what we do to integrate data visuals into our own work. You want to signal that you're about to use a data visual before you show it to your audience. So say you're in a report and you need to write something in there before you actually drop your data visual in. So you'd say something like, pepperoni is a popular pizza topping as shown in figure 1. You do that first and then you insert figure 1. You always want to refer to a data visual by its number and not where it is in the report or in the slide deck. So you want to avoid writing things like in the figure below, because that might change. Your report can undergo revisions. That would change where the actual data visual appears. Always go by the numbers. That's why they're there. And you want to keep readability and flow in mind. You want to make sure your data visual is large enough to be accessible. You can read all the text. Don't wrap text around them. This can be really hard to read. And it is okay for a data visual to break up a paragraph. Just continue that paragraph after the data visual as normal. C is for cite. If you are using a citation style like APA, you got to do a couple things, just like any other source. Create an APA style in-text citation and add it to the data visual. Place the data visual's label according to the rules we discussed earlier. So this came from a data visual I showed you earlier. Look right here, we have the label, the title, and we've got source, Murakami Wolf Swenson Studios, 2019. Hey, that looks like an APA style in text citation to me. Excellent. You also need to create an APA style references page entry for the data visual. It's a source as well. So what that looks like is something like this. The author's name and the date, just like an APA. The title of the data visual, and where it came from and all that other stuff. If, it has a journal volume and issue number, the page numbers, if it's something like that. You want to go with the APA rules for any other kind of publication. It's just that what you're pulling out instead of some text is a data visual. So we have this here, what would be the correct references page entry for this particular data visual. Excellent. E is for explain. Whenever you're using a data visual as a source, you got to always explain it. You got to always explain what it means and how it supports the point you made originally. Again, you can't just drop it in there and expect magic. You have to explain. And the explanation that you put in there should be as close to the data visual as possible. Like, for example, immediately after it in your report. So, for example, your explanation could look like this. Plain cheese remains a popular pizza flavor as 3 out of 8 slices on this pizza are cheese. However, pepperoni accounts for 4 of the 8 slices, and thus it may be concluded that pepperoni is the most desired topping. There's an explanation of our data visual. So we've gone through I, C, and E. Integrate, cite, explain. Let's put it all together and see what it looks like. Whoa. What do we have here? Well, it looks like we have an example of what a page in a business report could look like with a properly placed data visual. We've got our paragraphs here. We've got a heading. And as you can see right here, we have the integration of the data visual into our own writing. We have the data visual placed itself and it's cited properly. And then it's explained immediately underneath. Also notice that this data visual is easy to read. The text isn't wrapped around it. Even though it's breaking up a paragraph, that's okay. It's still easy to read, kind of going from top to bottom as we read in English. Hey, this looks pretty good. So it's complete, it's clean, and easy to read. Awesome. Very well done. And this is what I'm hoping to see out of papers that use data visuals in Business 102. So, some final thoughts on this data visual video. As you might have guessed by now, using data visuals effectively is not an easy task, so don't expect it to be. Give yourself enough time to think through creating and adapting data visuals. Go through all the necessary steps and double check everything. You also need to make sure that you use your resources. You got to look at examples, investigate what's available for your instructors, and ask for help from experts. It is impossible to do this without consulting resources, even for people who are experts. Data visuals are a whole big art unto themselves. And that kind of leads to my last point here. This is just an introduction to the wild world of data visualization. There are books upon books written about this. People specialize in this. And you may have seen listicles out there on the internet that are like the worst charts of all time. There are lots of those. And you know why? It's because data visuals are hard to make. But you can do it. You just need to think through it and give yourself some time. And that is all I got to say. Word to your mother. Good luck making your data visuals.